This video is a review of square and cube roots. So a square root function is y equals a times the square root of x minus h plus k. Cube root is y equals a times the cube root of x minus h plus k. A, h, and k are just numbers that are going to be in the function. X and y will stay as variables. So h underneath the square root and cube root represent a horizontal shift in the graph. K that's added on, occasionally subtracted on outside the square root or cube root, it represents a vertical shift in the graph. A, the value multiplied by the square root or the cube root, that would be if the graph is stretched or compressed. Okay, to graph, you're going to create a table. The first x value chosen in the table will be what makes the value under the square root or cube root sign equal 0. So this is always the first one that I pick. Okay, so let's try a couple of square root. Okay. Remember, a square root is what times itself equals the value under the square root sign. So we know in square roots we can never have a negative value under the square root sign. So the smallest value underneath can be 0. So I'm going to use that to help me create my table. So we're going to pick x and y. Okay. Because this is the most basic kind, I just have the square root of x. All I have to figure out is what I plug in for x to make it be 0 underneath. Okay, well, 0. And the square root of 0 is 0. I'm going to look at just my perfect squares because it's a whole lot easier and I need to use a calculator to be exact. But I know that if I put 1 under the square root sign, square root of 1 is 1. So I want it, that's my next perfect square I'm going to use. And then one more perfect square is if it's 4 underneath, square root of 4 is equal to 2. So for most of the square roots, I use these perfect squares. Make it be 0, 1, and 4 underneath the square root, and then it's very easy to evaluate. So then I'm going to graph when x is 0, y is 0, when x is 1, y is 1, and when x is 4, y is 2. So the graph kind of comes up like this, and it'll continue going. Again, it'll never be any of these x values that are less than 0 because it can never be negative underneath. All right, this one, we have a +1 underneath that square root sign. So again, looking at the perfect squares, what would make it be 0 underneath? Well, -1. If x is -1, because -1 plus 1 is 0. Square root of 0 is 0. My next perfect square, make it be 1 underneath. Well, that's when x is 0. 0 plus 1 is 1. Square root of 1 is 1. Next perfect square, what makes it be 4 underneath? Well, 3 plus 1 gives me 4, so x is 3. Square root of 4 is 2. Going to graph, when x is -1, y is 0. When x is 0, y is 1. And when x is 3, y is 2. So you can see that +1 underneath shifted my graph 1 to the left. Okay, so here's a couple of problems for you to try. Go ahead and pause the video here and then come back when you're ready for the answer. Okay, so the first one. I'm going to choose x values. Again, working with perfect squares. What makes it be 0 underneath the square root sign? That would be when x is 2. 2 minus 2 is 0. Square root of 0 is 0. Then figure out what would make it be 1 underneath. That would be 3 when x is 3. 3 minus 2 is 1. Square root of 1 is 1. And one more perfect square. What makes it be 4? That would be when x is 6, because 6 minus 2 is 4, and square root of 4 is 2. So when x is 2, y is 0. When x is 3, y is 1, and when x is 6, y is 2. Okay. Again, as you see, my graph shifted horizontally 2. Okay, This one has a +3 outside. So all we have underneath the square root sign is x. So this one's pretty easy when we're looking for the values to plug in for x. Well, what would it make? What would I plug in to make it be 0 underneath? Well, since it's just x, it'd be 0. Square root of 0 is 0. 0 plus 3 is 3. Now I want it to be 1 underneath, so I'm just going to plug in 1. Square root of 1 is 1. 1 plus 3 is 4. Then I want it to be 4 underneath, so that's what I'm going to plug in. Square root of 4 is 2. 2 plus 3 is 5. I'm going to graph these. When x is 0, y is 3. When x is 1, y is 4. And when x is 4, y is 5. Okay, so you can see it'll continue up, and when it was a value added on outside, it shifted it up vertically. All right, so here are some cube root functions. Cube root's a little different than square root, so don't get them confused. In square root, well, there's nothing multiplied by itself that'll ever equal a negative. But cube roots, you can have something multiplied by itself 3 times and it could be negative, because you could have the cube root of -1. Well, -1 times -1 is +1, times -1 again is -1. So cube roots, you can have negatives underneath. But we're still going to look at what would make it be 0. That's my first value I'm going to pick. So I'm going to choose x and y values again. But this time I'm going to choose a few more. I'm going to choose a couple values bigger. This will be where it makes it equal 0 underneath the cube root, and a couple values smaller than it. So I can see what's happening on both sides of my graph, of both sides of where it would be 0 underneath the cube root sign. Well, this is the most basic type of cube root, just cube root of x. There's nothing added on or subtracted on or multiplied. So, well, what would make it be 0 underneath? Well, 0. And the cube root of 0 is 0. Okay, I'm going to look at some of my perfect cubes. Well, cube root of 1 is 1. So I'm going to plug in 1. Cube root of 1 equals 1. My next perfect cube is if I plug in 8 underneath, because a cube root of 8 is equal to 2. So I'm going to plug in 8 and I get out 2. Okay, so now I'm going to look at the value smaller. Okay. If I plug in -1 for x, the cube root of -1 is -1, because -1 times -1 times -1 is -1. Okay, so my next perfect cube root, okay, I'm going to plug in -8. -2 times -2 times -2 is -8. So the cube root of -8 is -2. I'm going to graph these points. When x is 8, y is 2. When x is 1, y is 1. When x is 0, y is 0. When x is -1, y is -1. When x is -8, y is -2. So you can see this side's going up. Well, this side's kind of the exact opposite, and it's going down. So they look very similar, just opposites. Okay, so let's try this one. Remember, adding something on underneath the cube root sign, just like square root sign, we have to take it into account when we're choosing our x values. So I'm going to create my table. I'm going to create my table over here. Again, I'm going to make my middle value where it equals 0 underneath that cube root sign. I'm going to choose 2 larger where it's 0, and then 2 smaller. Okay, middle one. Well, what would make it be 0? Well, when x is -3. Okay, So negative 3 plus 3 is 0. Cube root of 0 is 0. Okay, then I'm going to look at my perfect cubes that are positive. So if I make it be 1 underneath the cube root, well, that would be when x is negative 2. Negative 2 plus 3 is 1. Cube root of 1 is 1. Okay, my next perfect cube, I want it to be 8 underneath. Well, that would be when x is 5, because 5 plus 3 is 8. Cube root of 8 is 2. All right, now I'm going to go the opposite direction. This is where it's 0 underneath. I want to know when it's negative 1 underneath. Well, the value I need to plug in for x to make it be negative 1 underneath is negative 4. Cube root, negative 4 plus 3 is negative 1. Cube root of negative 1 is negative 1. Now, last one, I want it to be negative 8 underneath. That's my last perfect cube for negative values that I'm going to use. Okay, so if I want this to be negative 8, well, what plus 3 gives me negative 8? Negative 11. Negative 11 plus 3 equals negative 8. Cube root of negative 8 is negative 2. I'm going to graph this. When x is 5, y is 2. When x is negative 2, y is 1. When x is negative 3, y is 0. When x is negative 4, y is negative 1. And when x is negative 11, y is negative 2. And I am going to go off the graph just because I want to see what's happening. So this is kind of the center of my graph. This side it's going up. This side it's going down. Okay. All right, I have 2 for you to try. Go ahead and attempt these 2. You can pause it here and come on back for the answers. All right, number 3. Not only is it multiplied by 2, but there's also a minus 4 outside the cube root, but there is only an x underneath the cube root. So picking the x values to plug in is fairly easy. Okay, 2 bigger than where it equals 0 under the cube root. That one would be where it would be 0, and then 2 smaller. So look at my middle value. Well, what makes it be 0 underneath the cube root? 0, because there's just an x underneath the cube root. Square root of 0 is 0. 0 times 2 is 0. And 0 minus 4 is negative 4. So when x is 0, y is negative 4. All right, so I'm going to plug in. I want it to be 1 underneath the cube root. Well, there's just x, so I'm going to plug in 1. Cube root of 1 is 1. 2 times 1 is 2. And 2 minus 4 is negative 2. Okay, now I want it to be 8 underneath. So I'm going to plug in 8. Cube root of 8 is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. And 4 minus 4 is 0. Okay, now I'm going to go my other direction, look at the negatives. Make it be negative 1 underneath. Cube root of negative 1 is negative 1. Negative 1 times 2 is negative 2. Negative 2 minus 4 is negative 6. Okay, then I want it to be negative 8 underneath. Cube root of negative 8 is negative 2. Negative 2 times 2 is negative 4. Negative 4 minus 4 is negative 8. So I'm going to graph. When x is 8, y is 0. When x is 1, y is negative 2. When x is 0, y is negative 4. When x is negative 1, y is negative 6. And when x is negative 8, y is negative 8. So this is kind of my center value. This side is going up. This side is going down. You can see that the minus 4 shifted it down. Multiplying it by 2 stretched it a little bit. All right, one more graph. We have x minus 2 underneath the cube root. Make my table. All right, what makes it be 0 underneath the cube root? Well, 2. So that's going to be my center value. 2 minus 2 is 0. Cube root of 0 is 0. Now I want it to be 1 underneath, so I'm going to choose 3. 3 minus 2 is 1. Cube root of 1 is 1. I want it to be 8 underneath. 10 minus 2 is 8. Cube root of 8 is 2. All right, now I'm going to go to the negatives. I want it to be negative 1 underneath. So I'm going to choose for x is 1. 1 minus 2 is negative 1. Cube root of negative 1 is negative 1. I want it to be negative 8 underneath, so I'm going to choose negative 6. Negative 6 minus 2 is negative 8. Cube root of negative 8 is negative 2. Okay, I'm going to graph. When x is 10, y is 2. When x is 3, y is 1. When x is 2, y is 0. When x is negative 1, when x is 1, y is negative 1. When x is negative 6, y is negative 2. All right, so this one you can see is shifted 2 to the right.